All right, well, good to see you all this morning. If you have a Bible, turn with me to that passage we just heard read, Proverbs chapter 1. Proverbs 1. Back in 2015, a Mormon vlogger and social media influencer took the world by storm. Her name was Ruby Frank. Their groans are happening already. If you don't know where this is going, it's not going to a good place, just as a heads up. Her name was Ruby Frank, and she started a YouTube channel called 8 Passengers, where she posted all about her home and family life. Much of it was specifically focused on how she parented her kids. And really from the very beginning of her sort of social media career, people from all over were mesmerized by what she had to share. In no time at all, in fact, her follower account was in the thousands, and then the hundreds of thousands, and then the millions. And by the year 2020, her YouTube channel had 2.5 million subscribers and 1 billion, with a B, views. In the early years, her follower list was full of people saying that Ruby's parenting wisdom changed their very lives for the better. Her comment section was full of things like, "Your content is a godsend for me and my family, thank you." Things like, "I've been focused on how to be a good mom for years and been confused about it, but thank you for lighting the way." And things like, "Ruby, thank you for showing me how to be an incredible, loving wife and mother like you are." Except here's the thing. As it turns out, Ruby Frank was none of those things. Just last year, she was tried and convicted for aggravated child abuse towards her kids and is currently serving jail time in a Utah prison because of it. Evidently, underneath all the smiling faces and the life-giving parenting techniques that she posted, there was an inclination in her towards control and manipulation and unbelievably cruel punishments towards her kids, not to mention an entirely dysfunctional marriage. Now, I don't bring that up to pile on the condemnation of Ruby Frank. Her story has been well documented by now, hence the groans from earlier, right? But I do think her story illustrates a couple pretty interesting things about human beings, about our society as a whole. I think first it tells us that we as a society evidently are very hungry for advice. Very hungry for wisdom, especially when it comes to something as potentially confusing and disorienting as parenting is. A lot of us are just itching for someone to tell us how to live life well, how to navigate parts of our life well. We crave wisdom and advice and technique constantly, to the point that apparently all it takes is a smiling Mormon mom with a cell phone camera, and people will evidently line up by the millions to see what she has to say. But I think it also illustrates, second thing, just how easy it is for us to fall for fake wisdom. How common shallow advice and shallow technique actually is. How easy it is for us to allow unproven, untested, and unverified wisdom into our lives. I mean, Ruby Frank was the very epitome of it, right? Someone who was giving parenting advice to millions of people, all while her own parenting was toxic and her own home life was crumbling underneath her. And let's make no mistake about it this morning, this type of shallow wisdom that I'm talking about is being published and publicized in our world constantly. The internet right now is chock full of YouTube channels and Instagram profiles and Substacks and now AI chatbots, all just ready and waiting to tell you how you should live your life better. How you should parent, how you should date, how you should fix your marriage, how you should grow your portfolio, organize your home, expand your network, get rid of your dad bod. I've been getting a crazy amount of ads for that one recently, which is a little bit triggering to me. And all of this stuff is out there all of the time, right? And if you'll just give these people $9.99 a month, or sometimes just your email address and permission to spam it constantly, these people promise to transform your life for the better. And just for clarity here, I don't think all of that stuff is bad, not by a long shot, okay? I subscribe to at least a few of them myself. Those dad bod ads got me. They just got me. They hooked me in. So I'm not judging you if you subscribe to any of that. But there is something that we need to realize about all of those types of wisdom out there. And that's that at least the majority of the time, those things are untested wisdom. Untested wisdom. You don't know the other person on the other side of that interaction. You don't know them at all. You certainly don't know the intricacies of their life. Even if you're watching videos of their life, you apparently do not know the intricacies of their life. You don't have any idea whether that person is practicing what they're preaching to you or whether they're just trying to make a quick buck off of you. Which means at the end of the day, as far as you know, their advice, their wisdom is unverified and unproven. It could be real wisdom and real valuable advice, or it could be a complete and total sham. You simply do not know. In today's world, I think it is easier than ever to model our lives after advice that isn't advice at all. Wisdom that only looks and sounds like wisdom at the start. Easier than ever for us to fall for tips and tricks and techniques that will lead us nowhere and sometimes will actually lead us astray. And I bring all of that up because that, in a nutshell, is actually the message that we find in the book of the Bible known as Proverbs. If you are new with us, we have been spending the entirety of this year just walking through the Bible cover to cover. Many of us are using a reading plan that's available in the lobby and online to read from the Bible 5 days a week, every single week. And then here on Sundays, what we're doing is we're spending some time learning how to understand and apply what it is that we're reading. Last week, we kicked off a short series all about the parts of the Bible known as the wisdom books or wisdom literature in the Bible. So that's a category that includes the book of Proverbs, the book of Ecclesiastes, the book of Job, and sometimes the book of Song of Songs, depending on who you ask. But we covered Job last week. Today, we'll look at Proverbs, and the next 2 Sundays, we'll look at Ecclesiastes and Song of Songs in that order. But this past week in the reading plan, many of us cracked open the book of Proverbs, which in many ways is sort of the quintessential wisdom book of the Bible. It's sort of the introduction to all the wisdom literature, so to speak. And on the one hand, I think Proverbs is one of the most accessible books of the Bible to read, especially if you're new to the Bible, I would say. This book probably requires the least amount of context, the least amount of prior knowledge, or even faith in Jesus in order to understand. Just about anybody, I think, can open up the book of Proverbs, read a few lines, and at least track with much of what is said in that book. It's a very face value type of book, in other words. But at the same time, I think Proverbs is probably one of the least studied books of the Bible these days. I think a lot of people tend to overlook Proverbs because it is so straightforward, or maybe they tend to read it way too fast and don't give full consideration to what it is that it's saying. So today, what I thought we would do is just spend some time breaking down the essence of what this book of the Bible is all about, talking about how exactly it works, how it communicates to us. And I want to do all of that in hopes that we can uncover all that this book of the Bible has to teach us about finding lasting, true, verified wisdom in our life. How not to settle for wisdom counterfeits, in other words, as many of us are prone to do, and find true wisdom. So, take a look with me at the opening lines of this book, Proverbs 1, starting in verse 1. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. So this could mean that we are reading the Proverbs that Solomon wrote, or it could mean that we're reading the ones he compiled. My bet would be that it's some of both in this book. But either way, it's about to tell us what these Proverbs are for. Verse 2, for gaining wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for receiving instruction in prudent behavior. Now, chances are, the phrase prudent behavior to us sounds almost Victorian, right? Feels like we just walked out of like the 1700s, 1800s. Like prudent behavior sounds weird to us. But really, in the original language, that's just the word wisdom. again, the same word that we saw in verse 2. So basically, we're still talking about wisdom on the way that we choose to live our lives. And we're talking about, second half of verse 3, continuing, for doing what is right and just and fair. So this book has also intended us to become a more just, more equitable type of person. For giving prudence, which here just means something like discretion or discernment to those who are simple, those who are naive. We'll get to that here in just a bit. Knowledge and discretion to the young. And then let the wise listen and add to their learning. And let the discerning get guidance for understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles of the wise. So this book of the Bible, Proverbs, is meant to help the naive, the simple, not be simple, and to help the wise gain even more wisdom. That's what it just said. So really, no matter where you're at on the wisdom spectrum currently, this book is for you. It helps everyone, in other words, no matter where you're at. Now, we're going to circle back to verse 7 towards the end of our time because it's really, really important. But for now, I want you to skip down with me to verse 20 because I think there's a word picture, there's an image that we're given here that I find particularly helpful on all of this. Verse 20 of chapter 1 says, out in the open, wisdom calls aloud. She raises her voice in the public square. On top of the wall, she cries out. At the city gate, she makes her speech. How long will you who are simple love your simple ways? She says. How long will mockers delight in mockery and fools hate knowledge? So here, Proverbs is sort of personifying wisdom itself as a woman who is crying out in the city streets for people to listen to her. She's calling out, hey, how long will people keep avoiding me? Avoiding wisdom. How long will people be content with being naive, with being arrogant, with being foolish? How long will people do that? It's this picture of how true wisdom has always been available to us as human beings, but we often neglect to access it. We'd rather just keep doing what we've always done, right? Or keep trying the latest tips and techniques or just believing what feels right to us in the moment. We'd often rather do any of that as human beings than accept true, tested, verified wisdom. That's what we as a society tend to do. And instead, we often we chase more after what is described in Proverbs chapter 5. So we'll put it up on the screen. You can also turn there if you want to. But the author here in chapter 5 is actually going to take that picture of wisdom as a woman crying out in the street, and it's going to eventually describe its alternative, what the alternate route to that is. So this is Proverbs 5, starting in verse 1. First, it sort of recaps what we've said already. It says, my son, pay attention to my wisdom. Turn your ear to my words of insight, that you may maintain discretion and your lips may preserve knowledge. But look at the next part. This is the alternative to Lady Wisdom. Verse 3. For the lips of the adulterous woman drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil. But in the end, she is as bitter as gall, sharp as a double-edged sword. Her feet go down to death. Her steps lead straight to the grave. She gives no thought to the way of life. Her paths wander aimlessly, but she does not know it. So as you're reading this, sort of on the surface, you may be inclined to think to yourself, okay, wait, so we were talking about wisdom and discernment and instruction, and now we're talking about adultery and promiscuous women. Like, what kind of a left turn is that in the passage? What you need to understand, though, is that this passage in Proverbs 5 is only kind of about adultery. Certainly, the Bible does warn against adultery. If you didn't know that, now you know. You're welcome for that. That's for free this morning. But there's actually something deeper going on in Proverbs 5 than just that type of warning. So the author in chapter 5 is actually contrasting Lady Wisdom from chapter 1 with the adulterous woman here in chapter 5. The adulterous woman is actually a sort of metaphor for turning away from true wisdom and towards things that only seem like wisdom. That's what's going on. It's saying that just like there is a way of life that wants to impart wisdom and insight and discernment to you in helpful ways, there's also a different way of life that seems enticing, that seems promising, that seems intriguing, maybe even seems seductive at times. But at the end, that second way of life leads to death instead of life. The idea, I think, is summed up a little more plainly without any metaphor at all in a line that we read several times in the book of Proverbs that goes something like this. You may have heard this before. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death. That's the message here. So here's my question. With all of that in mind, how do we avoid taking that second path towards what is not wisdom? If there are certain ways of living that go badly for us in the end, ways that Proverbs actually warns us against constantly, what are those paths exactly? What do they look like? How do we spot them so that we know to avoid them? Throughout the book of Proverbs, and really from that passage we just read at the end of chapter 1, it would appear that there are at least two different enemies of wisdom that are cautioned against. Two different sort of postures or dispositions in people that often prevent us from growing in true wisdom. So I want to show you what these two enemies of wisdom are, and I want to spend a little bit of time unpacking each one because I think it's important that we begin to identify those things in our life wherever they occur so that we can find true wisdom by contrast. So, first enemy of wisdom that we see throughout the book of Proverbs is what Proverbs will call simplicity. Simplicity. So in Proverbs, a simple person is a way of describing a person who is sort of naive or short-sighted or undiscerning in the way that they approach their life. These people rarely stop to ask questions of things like, is that true? Is that right? Is that accurate? Is that actually how the world works? A simple person often neglects to ask those types of questions about things in their life. So Proverbs actually summarizes it well over in chapter 14. We'll put this up on the screen, where it says this about the simple. The simple believe anything, but the prudent give thought to their steps. So maybe the most straightforward description of a simple person is just that they believe anything. They believe anything. They're a bit gullible, in other words. So they hear something from a friend of theirs or a family member of theirs. They read something on the internet. They find out about something from an Instagram post or online, and the only substantial filter that a simple person runs that through is, well, that feels right to me. That seems right, so it must be right. That's the posture of a simple person in the book of Proverbs. I once heard somebody say it like this. I found this really helpful. They said, if you don't know the scriptures, you will be a slave to whatever sounds right. That's it. That's simplicity. That's what Proverbs cautions us against. So I'll say I once saw the perfect example of this up close, playing out in real time. So I remember at one point I was at a luncheon for pastors where the subject of the luncheon was how to structure small groups in your church. And the guy who was speaking, who was also a pastor, he said, quote, "You can't put spiritually mature people in small groups with spiritually immature people because the spiritually mature people will get frustrated at the immaturity and they will leave." That was the advice. And I looked across the room at this luncheon and I watched nearly every pastor's head nod in agreement at this statement. And I'll be honest, when I first heard it, my head nodded in agreement. I was like, yeah, that sounds right. You can't do that. Obviously, that would be frustrating to them. But then I remembered later verses like Romans 15:1, where it says, quote, "We who are strong as followers of Jesus have an obligation to bear with those who are weak and not to please ourselves." So even though what the pastor said sounded correct, and even though everybody in the room nodded their head in agreement, and these people know the scriptures, somehow they still missed that the statement being made was not true. So you can't just roll with what sounds right what feels right to you in the moment. This is why here at City Church, simply speaking, every life group is made up of people who are just exploring faith, who are new to faith, and people who have been following Jesus for years, and ideally everything in between, because we want to build what we do here, not just on what feels right or what sounds right or what is convenient, but on what is true. We want to base it on what the scriptures actually teach. The simple believe anything, but the prudent give thought to their steps, Proverbs says. So I'll just ask you on this before we move to the next one. For you, do you have a tendency in your life to make decisions based on little more than the vibes being right? Do you have a tendency when you make major decisions in your life to just go with your gut or follow your heart and not really consider much at all outside of those two filters? Do you have a tendency towards just believing anything you hear almost as soon as you hear it without testing it? Do you have a tendency towards only reading from news sources in your life that confirm your pre-existing bias? If any of those things are persistent tendencies in your heart, it's worth considering whether you need to heed the warning that Proverbs gives us about being simple. The simple believe anything, but the prudent, the wise, give thought to their steps. So that's the first enemy of wisdom that we see over and over again in the book of Proverbs, simplicity. The second enemy of wisdom that we see is on the other end of the spectrum, and it's what we might call arrogance. Arrogance. So throughout the book of Proverbs, another enemy of wisdom is described with the word arrogance, or sometimes with the word pride or proud. Often Proverbs will use those terms, in fact, interchangeably with a person that it calls a mocker or a scoffer. We saw that earlier. So one of the telltale signs that a person is arrogant, according to Proverbs, is that they spend a lot of time mocking or scoffing at people and things around them. Now, sometimes they do that in jest, right? Like they're simply poking fun at people or things in their life. They make condescending jokes at the expense of others or at the expense of things that other people like. Other times, I've seen it happen way more aggressively, right? So you'll tell a arrogant person about something that you experienced or something you learned or something you're thinking about, and the arrogant person is very quickly to scoff at that and go, oh, let me tell you why that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. You ever met somebody like this? Okay, this is a scoffer, a mocker. It's an arrogant person. That's what Proverbs would call arrogance. It's a sign of pride and arrogance in a person's life. So here's what's interesting to me, if you think about it. Arrogant mocking, in many ways, is the sinful opposite of being simple. So a simple person believes everything they hear, whether or not it's true. A mocking person believes nothing they hear, even when it is true. An arrogant person will actually deny or downplay or drown everything out, any new idea out, because they think they already know everything that they need to know in their life. Or bare minimum, they think they already know more than most people around them do. Which is also why they have a very difficult time growing in wisdom or receiving input or correction from other people in their life, because their functional belief is that they already know more than the person who is correcting them. So why would they listen to what is being said? That's the disposition of arrogance. And when you spend all of your time doing that, Proverbs says, it is very, very difficult for you to grow in wisdom in your life. Simply put, if you think everybody else is an idiot, you can't ever learn from anybody else. So take a look at a few of the different ways that Proverbs actually describes this posture that we're talking about. I'll just hit 3 of them sort of rapid fire for you. So first, the mocker seeks wisdom and finds none, but knowledge comes easily to the discerning. Mockers resent correction, so they avoid the wise. Do not rebuke mockers or they will hate you. Rebuke the wise and they will love you. So if you constantly find yourself mocking people or ideas, if you walk into a room most of the time and you think to yourself, man, nobody in this room knows as much as me about stuff. If you find yourself nearly always resenting or avoiding correction or rebuke in your life when it is offered to you, chances are you are the type of person that Proverbs is warning against here. And what's more is that you are probably missing out on a lot of wisdom in your life as a result. Arrogance and mocking and scoffing at things can actually prevent a person from growing in wisdom. So, two equal and opposite dispositions in people, and two enemies of growing in wisdom: simplicity and arrogance. As you read through the book of Proverbs over the next week or two, I want you to look for these two postures coming up time and time again as hindrances to a person growing in true biblical wisdom. Sometimes Proverbs will actually put both of these postures in one overarching category that it calls foolishness, or being a fool. Someone who is a fool in the world of Proverbs is someone who is either too simple or too arrogant to grow at all in wisdom. So in just a moment, what I want us to do is I want us to look at the flip side of all of that. I want us to talk about where Proverbs says that we can find true wisdom instead of either of those things. But before we do that, I just want to hit on one other very important idea to helping us read and understand the book of Proverbs. And I want you to lean in here, because in my experience, this right here, what we're about to talk about now, is where a lot of people actually go wrong in understanding what Proverbs is and isn't saying. So, to fully understand Proverbs, I would argue you need to understand the difference between promises and observations. Promises and observations. So the book of Proverbs, despite what you may have heard about it, is not primarily intended to be a book of promises, at least not most of it. Other parts of the Bible are promises. So, for instance, behold, I am with you even to the end of the age. That's a promise in the Bible. It's a guarantee. Neither height nor depth nor anything else in all of creation is able to separate you from the love of God in Christ Jesus. That's a promise. That's a guarantee. And at least some people tend to read the book of Proverbs like it is also a book of promises. The problem is that that's not what Proverbs is. Proverbs, rather, I would argue, is a book full of observations about life. So the author is observing the way that the world typically works, not necessarily the way that it always works. Proverbs is not giving you guarantees, it's giving you observations about life. So just to give you a couple examples of this. Proverbs is not telling you that if you pay attention to your finances, you will never ever experience financial difficulty. But it is telling us that on the whole, people who pay attention to their finances well experience less financial difficulty than people that don't. Does that make sense? It's not a promise, it's an observation. Proverbs is not promising you that if you work hard, you will always have what you need and what you want. But it is observing that people who do work hard more often have what they need and what they want than people that don't work hard. Does that make sense? It's an observation about the way the world typically works, not the way the world always works, without exception. Proverbs is not a book of promises. If for no other reason, then there are stories in the Bible itself that serve basically as exceptions to the rules that we read about in Proverbs. So, for instance, Proverbs chapter 3, verse 33 says, quote, "The Lord's curse is on the house of the wicked, but he blesses the home of the righteous." But just last Sunday, we looked in detail at a book of the Bible where a very righteous guy named Job experienced curse instead of blessing. So if you read the book of Proverbs like it is a book of promises, you will end up very confused, maybe even a little bit frustrated and disillusioned at the results that you get. But if you view Proverbs as a book of observations about the way that life typically works, the way the world typically works, then I believe you will find true wisdom through it. So, that said, let's land the plane this morning by talking about just that. Where do we find true wisdom? If we want to forsake simplicity in our life, if we want to forsake arrogance and find true wisdom through this book of the Bible, where exactly should we start with that? Conveniently, that's what the final verse of our original passage tells us. So let's look at the end of Proverbs chapter 1, the end of the passage we read earlier. If you still got your Bibles open, in verse 7. Here is the key to wisdom. Verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. What is the beginning of knowledge? The fear of the Lord. But fools despise wisdom and instruction. So Proverbs tells us right here in verse 7 that if we want knowledge, if we want to obtain true wisdom in our life, it all starts with what it calls the fear of the Lord. Now, when I was growing up in church, I had quite a few people tell me that fearing God doesn't actually mean what it sounds like it means, right? That it really means something more like having a healthy respect for God or an awe for God. And I think the people that told me that were well-intentioned. I think they just didn't want me to be terrified of God, which is a good goal. That's fine. But I would be remiss this morning if I did not point out that the word in the Hebrew language for fear, there in verse 7, does actually mean fear. So here's maybe the way I would describe it. Hopefully this gives us a picture for what is intended in this part of the passage. So imagine with me that you are standing at the widest, highest, most expansive part of the Grand Canyon. There's actually something there now called the Grand Canyon Skywalk. I think we've got a picture of it. Right? Yeah. That was my sentiment when I saw that picture too. It's this U-shaped, I think, suspension bridge that goes out over one of the widest parts of the canyon. Now, I've never been to this skywalk. I don't know if I will go, to be honest with you. But I sure can imagine the type of thing I would feel if I were to walk out onto that bridge, right? I can imagine that if I were standing on that bridge looking out over the Grand Canyon, I would in fact be in awe of the canyon, right? I would be amazed by the canyon. There would be almost a respect, a reverence in me for what I'm looking at and the magnitude of it all, the expanse of it all. And at the very same time, I would imagine there would be some fear in me of the canyon, right? Like there would be an awareness in me that if I were to find myself on the other side of that railing, that it would go very bad for me as a result. Now listen, that fear is very specific in its nature, right? I don't feel only fear in that moment. I also feel amazement and joy and reverence and awe for what I'm looking at. But I do feel fear at being on the wrong side of that interaction with the canyon. Also, that fear that I feel in that moment is very purposeful. It's very practical in its nature. It's actually my fear of the canyon that keeps me on the inside of the skywalk instead of on the outside of it, right? And it's not an irrational fear. I'm not fearful that the canyon is just going to reach out and get me at any point for no reason. But what I feel is a fear, a real fear, of interacting with the canyon flippantly, carelessly, in a way that does not see it for what it is. Okay, so all analogies are imperfect, right? But can you see how that connects to what Proverbs wants us to feel towards God? To what it means to have a healthy fear of the Lord. We're not meant to only be fearful of God. We're also meant to be amazed by God and in awe of God and joy from God and experience being loved by God. But at the same time, there can and should be a fear of interacting with God as if he's something less than he is. Of interacting with God as if his commands in the scriptures are polite suggestions and not commands. as if his wisdom is somehow open to any interpretation and not authoritative instruction from the God of the universe about our life. When you come face to face with who God truly is, there is, in fact, a healthy fear that results from that. Not a general fear that God might reach out at any point and smite you for no reason, but a fear that acknowledges God for who he is and understands just what it means to follow him and just how much is at stake if we don't. And that fear, Proverbs says, is where true wisdom has to begin. Learning how the world works, in other words, has to start with knowing the person who created the world in the first place. Understanding how to navigate our life starts with knowing the one who authored that life to begin with. If we want to know the way the world typically works, we have to know the fear of the Lord. And once we know the fear of the Lord, we walk through the gateway towards wisdom, towards true, lasting, verified wisdom. And listen, at a very practical level, that fear of the Lord that we're talking about, it addresses both our simplicity and our arrogance. It addresses our simplicity because the fear of God has to do with understanding how big and how wise and how powerful God is. And when you understand that about God, it helps you see that there is more to this world than what meets the eye, than what my gut tells me, than what my heart cries out for me to follow. It tells me that there is something more profound, more nuanced than just following whatever looks right and seems right and sounds right to you in the moment. And when a person who is simple realizes that, they become less simple, less naive over time as a result. And when we possess the fear of the Lord, it undoes our arrogance. Because you begin to realize when you know the fear of the Lord that there is somebody who knows it all, but that somebody is not you. Which means you gain the ability over time through the fear of the Lord to listen to other people, to hear their instruction and their wisdom, to grow in your understanding of the world around you and mature in the way that you view the world as a result. Because the fear of the Lord has appropriately humbled you to be able to do that well in ways that your arrogance previously prevented you from doing. Am I making sense? Okay. So this morning, I just want us to close as practically as possible due to how practical of a book the book of Proverbs actually is. The question I want us all to consider today before we're done is this. What does your relationship to the source of wisdom look like? What does your relationship to the source of wisdom look like? What does the fear of the Lord, in other words, look like in your life right now? When you need wisdom and advice and input, guidance, help, all of that, in those moments especially, where do you most quickly and immediately turn? When you've got a career decision to make before you, do you go here to what feels right? To what your heart or to what your gut tell you to do and nothing else? Or do you go here to what the scriptures might incline you to consider? When you are feeling lonely and you don't know what else to do with it, you don't know where to take it, do you go here and just start swiping for the first match? Or do you go here to a community of faith who wants to walk with you through your loneliness and ideally help you feel a little bit less of it as a result? When you have no clue how to parent, to bring it full circle, right? And let's be honest, parents in the room, most days we feel like we have no clue how to parent. When you don't know how to parent, do you Google search it? You go to ChatGPT, parenting blogs, Substacks, Instagram pages, you look to the experts on it? Or do you seek out someone in this community who loves Jesus, who's probably been through a strikingly similar parenting season to you, and who has come out the other side of it with things to teach you about it? And ultimately, here's the question: when you need wisdom, do you trust in this, or do you go to the one who possesses all wisdom? James chapter 1 says it this way: if any of you lacks wisdom, and this, by the way, is a promise. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. Now, I should clarify, we don't always do the best job at listening to that wisdom when God provides it, but he always provides it. Wisdom, true, lasting, verified wisdom, is available to us. In fact, it's crying out to each of us. It's accessible to us right now via the one who made the world and therefore knows exactly how the world works. He makes his wisdom available to us in a myriad of different ways. The only question is, will we seek it out? And when it's offered, will we listen and receive it for what it is? That's the question this morning. So in just a moment, we're going to go to the tables all around this room. And those of us who are followers of Jesus are going to take communion there. Communion is one tangible way that we embody our receptiveness to the God of the universe, the source, the true source of wisdom. It's where we remember that he sent his son Jesus to the cross to give us permanent, instant access to him and his wisdom, to give us gifts like the scriptures and like prayer and like other Holy Spirit-filled believers, all as these tangible, constant sources of God's wisdom in our life. So when we approach these tables all around the room, we remember Jesus. We remember everything that he made available to us for our good and for his glory. So if you're a follower of Jesus in the room, or if you want to become a follower of Jesus in the room this morning for the first time, you are invited to the tables to participate in that with us. Our prayer team will be down front. If you need someone to talk to or someone to pray for you, let me pray for us and we'll respond in worship.